I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan. A couple months ago, I did a Q&A, and one of the questions was about my political ideology, and I was asked if I considered myself neoliberal, and I said, yeah, I would consider myself neoliberal. And then I kind of gave a little bit more detail, expanded on that a bit in a follow-up Q&A, because
why did I quit Raw? That was one of the questions behind her.
People were kind of mad at me. It ranged from people confusing neoliberalism and libertarianism, they're not the same thing, to kind of like you're dead to me type comments for not opposing capitalism, even equating it to fascism, even saying that it was inconsistent with veganism. So I wanted to address it, the kind of extreme anti-capitalist sentiment and how that relates to veganism. Shouldn't be controversial. For those who don't know, neoliberal is like your typical left-leaning social progressive, but also being generally pro-free market with few restrictions on a lot of industries like housing, but also very pro-welfare state as
Okay. No, it's not. Like libertarian is more, I think.
More extreme, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think neoliberal, I think like we would call a lot of things neoliberal that aren't really like sort of principled ideological libertarianism.
Yes.
That's like, I think that so yes, I think that part's kind of okay. Saying that like, saying that neoliberalism, means something that's different from libertarianism. But
yeah, it's not that different though, is it? It's like, I mean, like didn't like the people who founded like the Mises Institute also be like neoliberals? And
so there are a couple of different things that I think could get mixed up here. One is like the word neoliberalism. The original people who started using that word, who applied it to themselves, were like soft libertarians, basically. Like Austrian economy, economics, kind of like those are the people you're talking about, right? Who actually called themselves neoliberals. But in 2023, it's not by and large applied to to like those people. Usually it's used to describe like a set of trends in the politics of countries like the US, the UK, and a bunch of other places, but which is basically a revival of a more laissez-faire, less social democratic kind of capitalism, kind of especially when that when support for that manifests itself in traditionally liberal or left parties, right? Like that's I think roughly what most people mean by neoliberalism. But what this chick is talking about is a way that basically some people who are terminally online have appropriated the word neoliberalism to talk about something that really has almost nothing to do with what anybody in anywhere but Twitter means by neoliberalism. I mean, that I shouldn't say that. It doesn't have nothing to do with it, but it's like, it's very different, right? Where basically what she means is like, I don't know, shit that Matt Iglesias thinks, right? That like, if you're sort of a Twitter person who likes centrist Democrats, like the combination of views you're gonna come up with, well, that, we really like free markets. We think a lot of things should be deregulated, such as housing markets. She's going to throw in the YIMBYism there.
Right.
But like people like this are like generally like, they're at least sort of moderately in favor of a welfare state or whatever, which really I think misses the point. Because when we talk, like, really shows you the disconnect between the Twitter usage, like the Twitter self-usage of neoliberal by people who like put that little globe symbol in their profiles and like actually go around calling themselves neoliberals, and what everybody else means by neoliberalism, because a lot of the stuff that the rest of us mean by neoliberalism has to do with, in fact, with rollbacks to the welfare state, especially as those are embraced by politicians like, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair in the 1990s, that it's like, oh, they're becoming, neoliberals, going for the revival of this sort of more free market model of capitalism. So, the way she's using this is the way she's using the term is one that I find very annoying, but I'm sure that'll be the last annoying thing about this video.
Let's see.
Libertarians would say. Neoliberals want a substantial safety net, often even supporting public options like healthcare, for instance. Not all neoliberals do. Of course, there's going to be disagreement when the private options aren't serving the public. Conservatives often accuse neoliberals of being socialists because they accuse everyone of being socialist, advocating for higher taxation, welfare. But ultimately, the wealth in society that funds that welfare is generated by capitalist mechanisms. Same is the case in, what people call European socialism, which isn't really socialism.
So she's basically describing social democracy.
Motives, still has private ownership, even if a few select industries are publicly owned. Since socialism is commonly defined,
what she's describing is like social democracy, where she likes social democracy, something a little bit more free market, where she likes that. And like, I don't know why we're supposed to call that neoliberalism, but whatever, give her that. Let's keep going.
Is the question I want to answer. Philosophy is essential when it comes to ethics, but you can't just think really hard to figure out empirical facts, right? Like when it comes to economics and economic policies, and which actually work in practice, which result in a functioning system that promotes a GDP that's conducive to human well-being. You can think up an ethical system in which it is wrong for one person to ever profit off the work of another person. You can call that exploitation, but in order to put that into practice, you have to just not care about the consequences at all. You would have to ignore all of the times communism has been tried and all of the times it has failed, which is every single time it's been tried, it has failed. It has caused immeasurable suffering and death. A consequentialist, I care about consequences in terms of suffering. Most people care more about having a job, helping their family, than they do about some abstract principle that says it's wrong for their bosses to make a profit off of their labor. And I care more about what people want than I do deciding what people want for them or what I think is better for them based on some sort of cosmic justice. Injustice in and of itself is not harm. It's only harm when the consequences of injustice actually harm people or sentient beings. And that harm can range from material harm, disease, lead in your water being shot, to immaterial harm like damaged self-esteem. There may be some level of inevitable harm there when we're talking about capitalism. I'm sure there is. But that only matters if there is an alternative that is better, that if the harm that capitalism causes is worse than some sort of evidence-based alternative. But there is no evidence-based alternative. Or there is one, but the evidence goes in the opposite direction. Talking about ending capitalism because of the inevitable harms without some solution, without something that actually works better, is like talking about ending food because food on some level is inevitably harmful. True, but maybe dying is worse. Regulated capitalism with a strong safety net is the best system we have based on the systems we actually have evidence on, which is to say probably quite a bit more welfare than we currently have in the US. It's unreasonable to advocate for hypothetical alternatives when they range from untested to repeated failures. Again, you can't just reason out the ideal economic system for humans or for a particular country without evidence in practice. That's not being rational, it's not being scientifically minded, it's being dogmatic. I've talked before about how non-all use is abuse. The same goes for exploitation, which refers to
before we get to the veganism, which is always a good way to start a sentence. But yes, before we get to the veganism, just want to address the argument here, which is two things, right? I heard two of them, which are one, well, the idea that there's something objectionable about exploitation seems very abstract. And so what should really matter is that people are getting the things that they care about. That's one. And then the other one was, what about Russia, essentially, right? Like it's just like Sabine Hossenfelder, right? It's, well, the capital C communist countries during the Cold War, or the holdouts, such that that there might still be any, like that those are bad, and therefore it's capitalism or nothing. And she kind of gestures a little bit about some people might have some other ideas, but she says that since we haven't seen those tested, we shouldn't like those, or we shouldn't take that seriously. So, few quick thoughts about those arguments. On the first one, that exploitation is very abstract. I think here's a way of making it less abstract. Say, oh, well, what, you've got some abstract moral principle that says that it's bad if your boss makes a profit from you. Well, what exploitation means is that workers, or workers in communities, whatever you think the right relevant unit is, but let's just say workers aren't in control of the product of their labor, and they don't get to decide how it's divvied up. Now, that doesn't mean that if they did get to decide, then 100% of it would go into their take-home income. In fact, a point that Karl Marx makes in the first chapter of the Critique of the Gotha Program, there's also a footnote in Capital like this, is no, I mean, clearly that's not how it could work. That there's, if nothing else, there's like new factory equipment to buy, and old factory equipment to fix when it breaks down, right? So the means of production themselves like need a certain amount of continuing investment. Then there's also collective needs like schools and hospitals. There's also, I mean, he puts it in a very 19th century way there, but he says the sort of thing that the existing society calls poor relief. So what we would today just call like the welfare state, right? That he says basically, okay, what about children? What about old people? What about people who, for whatever reason, can't work, right? Perhaps they're, disabled in some way, right? So clearly, it would be the case that in any system, the immediate producers aren't getting 100% of what they're producing. That's not the objection. The point is that is who gets to decide, right? That's like, yeah, sure. Some of it, some of it in a better system would be going to continue investment in the means of production. Some of it would be going to schools, hospitals, income for people who are unable to work, etc. But again, it's not a question of just what the division is. It's a question of who gets to decide the division. And if you think about this, to make it a little bit more grounded, she wants to talk about empirical evidence from things that have already been tried, and I would point out that just on a scientifically minded level, I think that was the phrase she used, you do have to actually try some new things every now and again to see what happens. But even if we're just going to talk about existing things, like, look, we have worker cooperatives under capitalism. I think there are important differences between the way those play out under capitalism and how they might in an economic system that was structured differently. But just talk about worker co-ops under capitalism. Worker co-ops don't have perfectly flat wage scales. There are any number of reasons why in an enterprise where the workers are deciding what happens to the revenue they're generating, why it might not be perfectly flat. You might need to pay some people more to incentivize them to take jobs that involve a lot of stress and responsibility. Conversely, you might need to pay people more to incentivize them to take really dirty or dangerous jobs, rare technical skills, etc. But if, I don't know, we have a package delivery collective and somebody comes to the meeting where everybody gets to democratically decide how the proceeds are divvied up and says, hey, I was thinking, since this whole thing was my idea in the first place, the rest of you shouldn't be paid that much, but in fact, some of you might have to take second jobs, sorry. But I should be paid so much that I can literally afford to buy my own spaceship. I don't know. I don't see a lot of people voting for that at that meeting, right? I think that I think this hypothetical character, let's call him Jeff, like I think he might lose that vote, right? So I mean that's a way of, I think, making the point about exploitation seem a little bit less abstract, that the fact that the means of production is in the hands of non-workers, this is the point Marx goes on to make in the Critique of the Growth Program, like is upstream of the kind of distribution of resources you get under capitalism, which is fucking obscene. That you have CEOs making hundreds of times the income of workers, and that's not abstract, or just the ways that financial stress and the inability to meet various needs impact on people's lives. That's not abstract. The way that political democracy becomes hollowed out when some people have so much more resources than others and can exert so much more influence, that's certainly not abstract. And you can say, yeah, all of these things to one extent or another, or not all, like many of these things to one extent or another can be sanded off through better regulation, welfare, etc. But something else that the empirical evidence shows us is that when you leave the capitalist class their economic power, they tend to try to use it to erode the gains that have already been won, to introduce neoliberal policies that reverse much of what has already been accomplished, and that lots of European countries that have introduced some degree of social democracy have experienced some degree of neoliberal rollback. Certainly that's true in the US of the New Deal Great Society welfare state, as much as that was always a pathetic shadow of European social democracy. And this is the point Rosa Luxemburg was making when she says, yeah, of course you need to fight for reforms, but if you stop at fighting for reforms, then you're like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain, and it just keeps getting pushed back down on you again. So again, I think that's not abstract either. And then last thing, because we need to get to the funny part and wrap up the post game, is just, okay, if you want to be in the business of defending capitalism, at some point you gotta actually talk to some people who disagree with you about this and find out what they think and what they advocate. And she's doing this thing where she says, well, the alternatives that are proposed range from it's too speculative to know to it's disastrous. Like, no, look, you're talking about Stalinism, and then you're talking about what? Like, do you even know what else people have proposed? Do you have any idea? Have you read any books about this? Have you read so much as a single solitary fucking Jacobin article about this? It kind of doesn't seem like it.
Unfair use. Some vegans say you can't be vegan unless you are socialist or communist, but there's nothing in the term or the definition that is
also dumb, by the way.
So the argument is something like veganism means no exploitation. Exploitation is capitalism. Therefore, veganism means no capitalism. Two very big problems with this. First, you have to accept the very specific Marxist definition of exploitation/capitalism, which is essentially begging the question when you define anti-exploitation as requiring Marxism because you've defined capitalism as inherently exploitative. I don't see any reason to accept this definition, the Marxist definition of exploitation. I think it's much better defined as unfair use, and what exactly that means is a lot more complex. Is there sometimes or even often exploitation in capitalistic systems? Of course. There are unambiguous cases, like obvious cases of exploitation, like wage theft and broken contracts. The same with animal agriculture. No choice is given to the animal, obviously, and obviously it's impossible for there to be any sort of fair exchanged or any sort of deal made. So yeah, pretty unambiguous exploitation. There's also a strong case to be made for exploitation in the breakdown of regulatory systems, like monopolies, but that doesn't mean we can't understand how to evaluate fair exchanges. Do we have a long way to go in creating a fairer market via regulation? Certainly. Arguably, we still struggle with monopolies, but that doesn't mean communism is the answer. Which brings me to the second problem.
Okay, God damn it. Stop. Let's stop for a second.
Alternative. The reason we can say animal agriculture is wrong.
Okay. This thing about monopolies really makes me think. Again, she has no idea what socialists think. She's never talked to one extensively. I mean, she's read some comments on her YouTube channel. You know, maybe the occasional angry email, but I don't think that she's read so much as like a 1,500 word Jacobin article laying out what anybody thinks, because like this assumption that it's like, oh, if we don't have perfect capitalism, that must be because of monopolies, because there's not enough competition. That has nothing to do with what the socialist critique is, right? I mean, the point, the point about exploitation, the point about all of this stuff is that if you don't own, means of production, and you live in a market society, then you have no realistic choice except for to rent yourself out to people who do, which means that those people get to decide how the proceeds of your labor are distributed, which has some very bad, very concrete human consequences that she's missed the point on, like we were just talking about. It also means that you just have to, like, you spend half of your waking hours taking orders from people that you don't elect. That's again the system of domination and subordination that seems normatively objectionable in and of itself. And what I really want to see here, and I really just want to laugh at the veganism, but I just keep getting distracted by the bad arguments. What I really want to see here is when she says, the last thing she said before we paused is, oh, there's no practical alternative. Is she actually going to discuss any of the details of any alternative that anybody has actually proposed and, what her objections are? Or is she just going to kind of assert that and move on?
But Ben, you missed that she took the brave stance of standing up against wage theft.
Yes, she said wage theft is bad. That's true.
Wrong is because we have well-established alternatives. We know humanity can survive on a plant-based diet. We can grow plants. We can grow only plants. We can feed the world's population, and we can do it without animal products. We just need a shift in the market, one product instead of another. If there were evidence that veganism had the same catastrophic consequences that communism does, like we couldn't grow plants without manure, or we didn't know how to make B12, then we couldn't say animal agriculture is wrong. We couldn't advocate for its abolition because we would have no viable alternative, unless or until like clean meat were a thing. Morality is a product of choice. When it comes to dietary habits and food production, we have a choice, and we need to start making the right choice. When it comes to economics, the claim that we have a viable choice in communism just is not true. None of this means that we shouldn't research economic theory and try to find something better. Just like in the hypothetical can't be vegan world, hopefully we would research how to make B12, how to farm without manure. What it does mean is that it's wrong to advocate for abolishing capitalism based on some hypothetical work and basically a leap of faith.
Let's be back.
Okay. The answer to the question,
like your Broadway hot,
I asked is she's just asserting it. Like no discussion whatsoever of any alternative that anybody has suggested. She doesn't know.
No. But she wants to get us to have alternatives to manure.
Yeah.
Like maybe we can grow stuff with her YouTube channel.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at one of her comments and they said that she can imagine the end of a practice that's been going on since like the dawn of human civilization, which is eating meat, but she can't imagine something that's been around for like a few hundred years in comparison, right? Of the end of capitalism, which is pretty true. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of. Yeah, it's a little weird because we'll see what she gets into. But I mean, she's basically saying we have the possibility to, all be vegan, but we just choose not to, which is kind of like, not really. I feel like she's just making into all these personal choices. It's kind of like the idea of like, we also have the resources to actually make sure that nobody lives in poverty, yet we choose not to, right? There's probably more than just personal choice going on here, and it probably has to do with the system at play, right? So it's kind of like I don't know. It's a very individualist approach as opposed to a systemic approach, for sure.
Don't like to tell people they're not vegan or fake vegan or anything like that. That said, I do think that anti-capitalist sentiment is inherently anti-vegan, at least currently. If we also mean the human animal when we talk about animals in the definition of veganism, and clearly anti-capitalists do, otherwise human economics would be irrelevant, then cruelty to humans is not vegan. Trying to push an entire society into, at best, an unknown situation, putting countless livelihoods and lives at risk within that society based on personal.
Isn't this just how she beat back the other argument?
To tear down.
It is exactly how she beat back the other argument. In fact, God, the people she was arguing against before at least had a definition of exploitation, and that there's she never stopped to consider why exploitation in that sense might be bad or whatever, but forget all that, right? Yes.
Yeah.
But when she said, oh, they're just begging the question, it's if you're just assuming that, anything other than capitalism involves unacceptable cruelty, then that would seem to be begging the question. Right. Also, I just love the fact that vegans are so monomaniacal that they can't, whatever, not all vegans. But a certain kind of vegan is so monomaniacal that it's they can't just have an argument about the ethics of capitalism. They have to frame it as which one is vegan. It's okay, well, we all agree that the sort of most fundamental moral principles be vegan. So how would this apply to a choice between economic systems?
That's kind of like how people treat entertainment these days too. Which TV show is progressive, which TV show is racist, which TV show is socialist, right? Because that's the point of a fictional program. You know what I mean? It's how does this other aspect of life, how do I shoehorn that into talking about my pet political project, whatever
exactly,
whatever that is? Things can be separate from each other, right? There's relationships between them. Obviously, I'd say there's probably a pretty strong relationship between capitalism and the meat industry, for example. But
but remember, there's no ethical veganism under communism.
All right, that's pretty good.
For no credible reason, any and all capitalistic systems, without regard for the human suffering that has always inevitably resulted, is cruel. I know the intent is not cruelty, and I'm not saying intent doesn't matter. It does when we're talking about, someone's personal character. But look, when we're talking about animal agriculture, the intent isn't cruelty there either. The intent is to produce a product and to make money. It's the outcome which is harmful, and the indifference to the outcome which is cruel. I don't think intent is any excuse in the face of overwhelming evidence of harm, and ideological blindness to that harm is no excuse. And going back to the second part of the definition of veganism, by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So no part of veganism as a moral choice makes any sense outside of a standard economic model of supply and demand. Without capitalism, eating plant-based is just symbolic. Promoting personal consumer actions and boycotts and alternatives as morally meaningful makes no sense. The presumption of a capitalistic context, a capitalistic society, is part of the definition of veganism. A denial of capitalism or opting out of capitalism in principle, not only does this make vegan ethics irrelevant, it fails to do good in the most cogent way that veganism acts on the world, by changing production. It's a failure to be vegan in any sense, from ethical principle to consequence. So again, I'm not going to call vegans who happen to be anti-capitalist not vegans, but the ideology of anti-capitalism seems inherently at odds with veganism, at least for now. I don't have any political ideology. I'm not, fervently pro-capitalism. I'm not committed to that. I'm not even committed to neoliberal. It's just kind of the closest descriptor to what I currently believe in terms of politics. I think the only
I'm really trying to wrap my mind around that last argument that we just heard. So she thinks, because so tell me if this is, maybe I zoned out there for a second and I didn't quite get it. Tell me if this was what you guys heard, that if we don't have capitalism, then you're consuming meat or not doesn't have any consequences because you're not like buying meat or not. Therefore, you're not sending like supply and demand, like price signals to the food producers that impact what they produce. Is that the argument?
Yeah, you did a better job than I did with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if that's it, right? Like, I mean, one, like just, having money and things being bought and sold, see above, is not the same thing as capitalism. So, we can have a socialist system where people can still have the option of buying regular Beyond Burgers if that's what she wants. But two, like, okay, let's say we have like a really radical form of socialism that's completely moneyless. Okay. Like, presumably at that point, the way that you try to eliminate meat production is like trying to like convince people to like democratically phase it out. But it's such a weird argument that it's like, well, like the thing that's important for veganism is that our consumer choices are like morally important because they're making a statement. So this is like, really, this sounds very close to just saying, look, the most important thing is that I find a way to signal my virtue. Like,
well,
it's like,
yeah.
Yeah, you can't virtual signal with communism.
So it's like, like that you're not going to, it's like, yes, let's say your consumer choices wouldn't matter, just for the sake of argument, that unlike any of those actually existing non-capitalist systems she mentioned that all have money, people still buy food with meat or not. Unlike all of those ones, she's considering a different socialism, which is an interesting switch, because earlier her whole argument was that that socialism is bad because North Korea is bad. But okay, so unlike any of those systems, you are as in USSR virtue signals you you are using money to buy products. So then in the you aren't using money to buy products, so therefore your food choices aren't morally important. But it's like, is that what matters to vegans, that like that their consumer choices feel like they matter? I thought they just objected to like killing animals.
I mean, this is a larger conversation, but it seems I thought the whole point was that it's wrong to kill animals. And then what would be an interesting discussion is which economic system would be more likely
to phase it out. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. And I think it's pretty hard to imagine that a system in which you could make tons and tons of fucking money with very little democratic blocks on what you're doing, right? It's just about, the only limit is how much is consumer choices, right? It's hard to imagine this current capitalist society transitioning into a vegan society. I mean, I think that it's a lot easier to imagine a socialist system, in my opinion, leading to something that maybe isn't like completely vegan, right? But like, let's say, democratically, society, decides that, hey, we should not invest money in meat production because it's not efficient, and and then it becomes probably would become a lot more expensive to eat meat in that situation. I mean, you would definitely need to build a movement, just like she needs to, but but the people behind that movement would actually have to get to have a direct say in what happens instead of hoping that their price signals, is read correctly by some capitalist.
So okay, but that's her whole thing. She doesn't want to build a movement. She doesn't want to do collective action. Like she wants to be a good person through her consumer choices. And it's like, look, factory farming might be kind of horrifying, but you know what's really horrifying? Not to get to feel like a good person because you made certain consumer choices. That is the ultimate horror. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.